I've said, if you ever find yourself being asked to give a talk to a group and you're not quite sure what to talk about, and it's any group at all you could do this with, just introduce yourself and have them do questions in a box. It's wonderful because you don't have to prep. It can be a little bit intimidating if you're not so good thinking on your feet. So perhaps it's the surgeon in me that prefers actually just to dive in and see how it goes. And if you're a little more internal medicine and like to plot it all out before you get going, this might not be a great strategy. So what I'm going to do is I have shuffled these because typically we're going to take about an hour, and typically we don't get through them all. So I have shuffled them. So if we don't get to yours, it's not because I was doing anything nasty. It may be providential or pure chance. That's a theological question, which we won't get into. And all of these people are pretty good, I'm assuming, are going to be good with me sending out email, what their email addresses. So I'm just sort of putting them all on the spot, but let me know afterwards. And so if you've got a question and by tomorrow afternoon as you're leaving, you haven't had a chance to find one of us and ask the question, email is always really helpful. And you can use that. All right? So I'm just going to launch in now. I'm going to ask the panelists to please keep your responses to 1 or 2 minutes so we get through as many of these as we can. And yes, Michelle is noting that I've got my clock on the floor here. There was a little guy noticed once that when the pastor stood up and started to preach, he put his watch down on the pulpit. And so the little guy asked his dad, "What does it mean when the reverend puts his watch on the pulpit?" And his father looked at him and said, "It doesn't mean anything at all, son." All right. So this is so this applies to 4 of us. And perhaps Michelle will have to speak this in terms of the theoretical or what you're expecting. But the question is, how did you know when you had found your godly spouse? I'll leave that open to interpretation. Anyone want to start with that?
Well, I could talk about it. She's here, so I have to be careful. Plug your ears. What happens is that we had a bit of an unusual initial meeting in the sense we kind of ignored each other for 9 months because we both were not looking at all for what we ended up finding in each other. Because she's Chinese and I was looking for someone not in medicine. And she wanted someone who was Chinese. But what happens is that as you get to know the person, it's not always necessarily what you think you're looking for, but sometimes God brings to your life what you need. And that ends up becoming what you're looking for later on. And the thing is, she helped me through a lot of difficult times towards the end of my studies. And also there was one thing that I had prayed for many years, even before I met her. I was hoping she would get to meet my grandparents before they passed away. And one thing that happened was we ended up getting really close to each other just before my grandfather died, and she got to meet him on his dying days. And that was something I'd been praying for years, so at least she would know what kind of a person they were. So it kind of brought it together for me. It kind of made me think about it a little more. And so there were some signs, but also you want someone that you can talk to openly and that you know that no matter what, they'll always support you and they'll be there for you. So trust is something very important. You'll always have your fights, your little petty arguments, habits that one has that irritate the other people. And that happens, but if you can trust each other and you know that you can talk to each other and you can always maintain that in a respectful situation and discuss it, then you might actually find someone that you can have a life with.
Okay. Anyone else in the panel I'm going to talk to that a little bit tomorrow morning, so I'm going to bow out of this question. Anyone else in the panel want to speak to that?
Well, it's hard to think back over 40 years.
It's a while ago, right?
It's a while ago, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We can keep going. That was a great answer.
I'm going to say
Paul wants to jump in.
10 seconds.
Sure.
Look at how the person treats family members. The pattern of relating to other people is remarkably consistent over lifetime. The other thing is, don't look at where the person's at, look at where the person wants to head.
I have to agree with that, because if you look at how people treat waiters and other people that work like cleaning the floors, if you see them respect everyone, you know that they will always be respectful towards you and be a caring person. If they treat other people like crap, but they are good to you, then you know that run.
You will be the waiter.
All right. So this is one for all of us. What do you hate about your job? And again, I will remind the panelists to be brief. So I guess I'll start this one. So every specialty has its thing that the specialty throws at you that's tough. And if you're going to choose that specialty, you need to be able to cope with what that thing is. So I'm taking hate as in the biblical hate, as in this is how the world shouldn't be. This creates a response in me, an anger in me that this is how the world is. So for me, that's the 37, 38 week pregnancy that comes in, and it always starts with the nurse phoning me and saying, I can't find a fetal heart, and ends with me having a picture of a beautiful heart on an ultrasound monitor that's not moving. And it's sad, but at the same time, there's a bit of righteous indignation about the choices that we made back at the beginning that made the world this way, because it shouldn't be this way. And the other one, but I've got ways to cope. The other one is the 35-year-old who comes in with a bit of bleeding, and you put the speculum in, and there's tumor. And again, you ask me what I hate about my job? That's what I hate. But I know God hates it too.
Compared to that, I can't say there's anything that I hate about my job.
Is there anything you dislike that makes a bad day?
It's not about the patients or the job. It shares a commonality. It's an environment, what the manager is like, which is one of the most compelling reasons why people will actually leave a job, whether they trust and support or whether they do not, and probably whether, to the people who work with me and under me, whether I love and trust and support them.
Okay, Francois?
For me, part of it is the politics, and part of it is the fact that a lot of people don't talk to their patients, and then they come to you completely confused, and no one ever took the time to explain anything to them. And it's frustrating to see this when even the person that's been following them for years never explained anything to them. So I take the time. I like the fact that in my practice I can afford that time, but at the same time it creates a lot of frustration because this should be the norm. People should know what's going on, and they should have the support instead of just going around confused and worried of what's going to happen because they have no idea.
Awesome.
Can I have a couple?
Sure.
One of the things that's always been tough is when you're getting an emergency and looking after a patient and trying to get them off to sleep and help them with whatever serious injuries they've had, and they don't even know yet that their husband is dead and their niece was in the backseat of the car and she's not doing very well. And you know that that patient is going to wake up to a world that is totally changed, and you're trying to tiptoe around all the questions that are being asked and get on with what has to be done to save her life. And those are hard days. But I confess that the politics and organizational things can be a real downer at times. We have a CEO at the major hospital in Kingston who has made the mantra for the hospital outstanding care always. We've been in gridlock. Well, when I left, we were still in gridlock for 3 days, which means that the hospital's stuffed full. Beds, people have been in emerge for who knows how long, and can't get beds up in the places that they belong. Surgeries are getting cancelled that are urgent, etc. And I find it hard to have that incredible mismatch with the reality and what people are saying. Oh yes, our motto, outstanding care, always. In fact, I got a little thing that I was supposed to put on my name tag, and I haven't taken it out of the mail slot yet, because it just annoyed me too much. So that mismatch between the reality and what people claim we can do.
I think the thing that I don't like about my job is that when you tell people what would be the best thing for them, they get mad at you. I never expected to get people mad at me when I started being a doctor or going into medical school. And yeah, if you're not giving someone what they want, they can be very angry, and it's not fun.
How do we most effectively engage our secular classmates and colleagues about ethical issues, abortion, euthanasia, personal integrity, when for us the reason for concern and issue is rooted in faith? Francois got a thought? Sure.
I think that one of the main fears is even if you put faith aside, it's abuse. Because I've spoken with my colleagues about these new laws, and they all have the same perspective, and some politicians have actually admitted to this. It's because the baby boomers are getting older, they don't know how they're going to afford it, so it's a cheap way to get rid of people. And that is an inappropriate approach to this. Whether you believe in the fact that we should always keep church and state separate or not, and that we shouldn't impose faith through politics, it does not change the fact that this is an incredible potential for abuse, especially when they speak about the fact that it should only be people who can actually express their decision and are apt to do so, and yet they talk about using it for people who are demented and inapt to make a decision. So essentially we'll be using it for people who cannot say no because they cannot have the judgment to say no. And yet it's just a nonsensical. There's nothing that actually that's expressed in a proper way, explained in a proper way, or there's no clear follow-up. You cannot do this properly in the way that our medical system is done. That's why doctors say, I trust my colleagues, but I do not trust the system. Because the system opens up for abuses through laws that can always be played around. Because there's no thought behind them. It's always black and white. And you can dance around once those are placed.
Mm-hmm. So as we were talking about this morning, you may bring to that discussion faith concepts and faith concerns, but phrased in neutral language, or you may be able to find in them concerns that resonate with you that actually have nothing to do with faith. And certainly on the euthanasia issue, CMDS is having that experience that there's also great concern from people who would identify as atheist or secular, or and it's there are partnerships that can form and conversations that can happen that don't have to be part of that. Yeah. I've always got a thought, so but I'll
read the clue.
Question. So, how do we effectively engage secular colleagues about ethical issues when, for us, our understanding of that issue is rooted in the faith, but that's not shared? That's how I'm interpreting the question.
With difficulty. But sometimes just ordinary conversation opens pathways that if you thought about it, and I think that those are God moments too, where sort of God just opens up a comment that you can just stretch in a slightly different direction and make a point that does resonate with the person because they were sort of halfway there. I think if you just sort of going up and just deciding to talk to somebody about something because you need to hear about this, that never doesn't work where I am.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my thought as well, that the question seems to assume a pearl or two that we can give you. And I think what you'll find is that actually every conversation with every individual about every issue ends up being in many ways unique. When I don't know what to do, I've learned from the Lutherans and also from Jewish rabbis that you can't get in trouble by asking questions. So if you ask a Lutheran a question, the first thing they'll say is, "So why do you ask?" Right? Which actually matters a great deal, particularly one-on-one. And somebody once complained to a rabbi, every time you ask a rabbi a question, all you get is a question. And he looked at the guy and said, "Well, what's wrong with a question?" But that you don't get in trouble that way, right? So if you want, what I've found is if you've got somebody who says something that you feel instinct, that's just completely wrong. But it's completely wrong for me because of a faith understanding. You don't have that faith understanding. Then just ask a question to get deeper into where they're coming from. And when someone challenges you with a question, so what do you think about, the one I would get often is, so what do you think about the birth control pill, right? And if I know you really well, let's launch into a conversation. If I don't know you well, I can say, well, why do you ask? Is this a theological question? Is this a question about the choices you're going to make in your reproduction? Is this a question about how you got wounded by somebody in your past? Is this a question about how I see the relationship between men and women? Is this a question about, right? Because if I launch into, if you're coming at it from one direction and I go in the wrong direction, we're not going to get there. So if you're not sure what to do, ask a question that demonstrates you're curious about them and gain some more knowledge, and often that gets you a lot further with the conversation.
If I can add one thing, the other thing is don't hesitate to just quietly speak your mind or your reaction to something. But I often see people not say anything, say in a staff meeting about something that bothers them, and then talk to me about it afterwards. I thought, why didn't you say it when the whole group was there, discussing it? It comes back to that courage I mentioned, yesterday, that even if you don't know how to say it or what to say it, sometimes if it just says, that does bother me, that at least gets something going.
Spark something. Oh.
Yeah.
Just quickly, most of these ethical issues have to do with increasing a person's autonomy when there's an existing cultural barrier to that. Abortion, euthanasia. We should make ourselves knowledgeable about what happens in those countries that have freely allowed these laws. The Bible says that which does not proceed from faith is sin. That's a hard sell to somebody who doesn't have faith. But if you just follow it logically along and see what the society will do with it once you open the Pandora's box. It's like you get a box of wildflower seeds and you decide to throw them out in your garden. You don't know which of those seeds are going to be invasive species. The best apologetic for something like that is to look at a country where they've planted them and see where it's gone.
Have your work ever interfered with having a family? Would you say you idolized work more than family, or vice versa? What is the difference between idolizing your work versus glorifying? Well, that's a separate question, sorry. Those of you who asked two questions, I'm putting your back in the thing. We'll see if we get your second question. First question, does work ever interfere with having a family? I'm going to rephrase that a little bit. Does work ever interfere with being who you need to be in your family? Right? Take that a little broader, because a bunch of you at this point have a family, but who you are in that family is different than who it'll be down the road. Would you say you idolize work more than family, or vice versa? Can we go from Michelle to this end and take about 30 seconds or a minute? Thoughts on work and being who you need to be in the family that you have.
Can I think about it?
Yeah, sorry. Start with Paul.
It hasn't really been a problem.
Okay, because?
Dentistry is not so intoxicating that... What may be intoxicating, though, is my need to be needed. If ever I find something like that, yes, it can threaten relationships at home. But then it's not really that the work is being idolized, it's self.
I think that that you have to be conscious of this when you choose the type of work you do. Because if you know that you're someone who's prone to putting a lot of time, for instance, for your patients, and you choose a career direction which makes it that your day can potentially never finish, then you're setting yourself up for this. It's to understand yourself, so then you can make choices that will limit the chances of this occurring. And then what you can do is have someone who's understanding, and also try to modify your work so this doesn't occur, change your schedule, and do the best you can. It'll never be perfect, but you do the best you can.
I agree with everything Francois said. And the word autonomy comes to me. One thing we have as physicians frequently is a fair bit of autonomy in choosing how we work and how much we work. Not if you're the only doctor in a town, but I've mentioned to a number of people I did choose to work part-time from the time kids came along and be able to take a job that could be 120% down to one that could leave room for family and community and church and things that I wanted to be involved in. But one thing I learned at actually it was an Ontario CMDS conference a number of years ago that I found a very useful trick. The speaker was talking about family issues, and somebody shared that when you're doing too much, one of the tests, if you have a family, is when you get to the front door at the end of the day, all you want to do is kick the cat. And if you just want to kick the cat, it's time to find something you can cut out of your schedule, because you're going to treat your spouse and your kids the same way. You may not kick them, but they're not going to get what they need. And I found that was a really useful hint to have been given, because I would realize, okay, I am going home and I wish I had another 6 hours to do X and finish that Y. And I realized, okay, I've got to clear something off the schedule. So it was a good safety measure for me.
Okay, so this is a hard one to answer because I don't have children, but when I was looking at what kind of residency to do, I was hoping I might have children. I sort of hope still, but not very hard anymore because I'm over 40, so it's not very hopeful. But nevertheless, I really liked internal medicine, but I knew that was very much intoxicating for me. That would be intoxicating, and I would be doing that all the time. I wouldn't be doing much else. So I was pretty much sure that that wasn't going to be a good idea. So I went into family thinking that if I wanted to go back, I potentially could go back later. And basically that gave you the flexibility. And I didn't set up a practice because I wanted to have that, not have people making me feel guilty for cutting back on hours or not being there when they thought I should be there. Because I see a lot of my friends, when they set up practices and then they had a hard time finding a locum to cover mat leaves and different things like this. So I didn't want their issue. And so you got used to a certain kind of life because of that. But then I'm going to be able to babysit my older brother's kids when they go away for the weekend, kind of thing. So I can be part of their families in different ways. So it's a good thing that way.
I think it is about recognizing when work has become an idol, which is the term that the question used, part of that is if given a choice, I'd rather be at work. Then there's a problem. It's fine to love work, and it's fine to get great satisfaction from it. And you're in medical school and in residency, to a degree, I buy the argument that life is awful because other people have made it that way. When you're 5 years into practice as a physician, I don't buy it anymore. How your life is 2 or 3 years into practice is entirely your own making. I've never encountered anyone who managed to elicit any sympathy from me on that. And also for whom, when I didn't start to ask questions about the choices they made, it wasn't clear that they had made some poor ones. So thinking about career, but also no matter what you do, even if you become, I don't know, whatever the worst possible lifestyle specialty you can think of, I can give you strategies that when you finish residency, you can have the life you want to have, but you'll have to be deliberate and creative. And if you just drift along, yeah, someday you may not be all that happy. This is a question for Allison. How do you approach patients' anxiety as an anesthesiologist when they are going into surgery that might not go well and cause death or permanent damage? Are you able to tell that person about Christ? As we're called to evangelize, how does that play out at a workplace in that sort of scenario?
In my hospital, I couldn't do that de novo from somebody I met that morning and did not have a relationship with them, because you wouldn't see them long enough to actually have that kind of opportunity. It would be inappropriate. I can certainly think of times I've been able to do that with people that I've been able to see in say a pre-assessment clinic or something like that. But even there, I'd say to evangelize in the sense of going through the gospel message, no, I'm not. We're in too secular a country at this point. On the other hand, you can look for circumstances where you, recognize that you know somebody from who you've seen at a church or your own church that you can offer to pray with them, and knowing that that is acceptable because that is part of their belief system. But to start de novo with somebody that you just said, hello, I'm Dr. Fraze and good to meet you, Mr. Brown, and then start on a gospel message would not actually be within what's allowed within our culture, and that would be considered invasive into personal territory and beliefs.
The next question is asking us to judge them. So let's see how this goes. What is our generation's greatest strength that can help advance the kingdom of God? What is our generation's greatest weakness that will hinder the advance of the kingdom of God? So what you're going to get now is our perceptions. Does anyone want to take that on?
I'd say our greatest weakness, and it's a weakness that we've seen in many generations, is despite what's written in the Bible and what even the Jewish and the Muslim religions say, we are not supposed to judge others. We pass judgment far too easily on others when it's never our place to do this. No matter where they are, no matter what their beliefs are, our place is to respect them, show kindness, love, and caring, and not treat anyone differently no matter what their beliefs are, no matter how they look, no matter how they act. A person who's mean to you does not mean you need to be mean to them. I think this is something that really needs to be worked on by every generation.
I'll talk. I think when I look at you guys, the strength I see is and again, how am I going to put this into, and I may actually be looking, my son is 16 and I spend a lot of time hanging out with a group of 16-year-old boys. I also spend a lot of time with medical students, and there is actually a bit of a gap between, yes, in a good way, but also in a generational way. Like I think this concept of generation, because the popular culture moves so fast, is shrinking, and so the late 20s is actually a different generation than late teens, which would not have been the case 50 years ago. So what I see is a moving away from the idea that scientism doesn't have the sway that it used to have. So what I wrestled with was the idea that there was no truth beyond what you could prove in a lab. And when I look at you guys and I look at my son's friends, the understanding of truth is shifting away from that. The greatest, and so there's an opportunity there. The greatest opportunity I think you guys have is that when I bring up church with those who don't go to church, or faith with those who aren't faithed, particularly if they're about 10 years older than me, I often encounter someone who's got baggage. They've been wounded. There's a reason. They grew up in church. They don't go to church anymore, and there's a story. My son's friends have no baggage because they have no church. Their parents got wounded and left. They've grown up without it. And so you bring up faith, you bring up church, there's not this scientism, you're nutty thing, and there's not any, oh, I know all about that, let me tell you your story. There's a, that's really interesting. This is all brand new and different. In some sense, the work that I felt I had to do was a lot of removing stones before you could plant any seed. I look at your peers and those that are younger, the field, there's no stones anymore. And that's, I think, a great opportunity that you guys are well perked to jump on. What's the weakness? The weakness is that you all have been told for your entire lives that your narrative is all about you. And all of your peers have been told that, and my son is immersed in a culture which every time somebody has something they want to sell or have influence, starts off with, you're amazing, you can do anything. And what it's done to my son's generation is that if they fail, it's entirely their fault. Because if you try hard enough, if you work hard enough, if you buy the right product, you will succeed at anything, right? And then when they fail, well, obviously they didn't buy the right product, or they didn't try hard enough, and there's nowhere to go. And so that teenagers are narcissistic, they always have been so. But there's a Blue Like Jazz, my favorite line in the entire book, Blue Like Jazz, is when the author says, the primary thing that God has been teaching me is that the story of the universe does not have me at the center.
Strength. I notice in your generation, there's been a spike of social concern about justice and extending resources and care to the poor in other nations and locally in deprived socioeconomic groups. A comment about strength and weakness in terms of thinking. You guys are amazing. I think you can do anything. I've even watched you play a game like Scrabble. I have no doubt that your synapses are better wired than mine. And the standards for getting into medical school, professional school, dental school, I'm convinced they're higher. You don't have to only be good in school now, you have to be able to run or jump or dance or sing or something like that and be really good at it. Plus, having run an orphanage somewhere and, Your generation is great at multitasking. You've got devices that train your brain to be able to look after many functions at the same time. Here's the weakness that is the backside of that multitasking. The capacity to meditate and think slowly and carefully to the depth about a question, about yourself or about God. It's not there. When I try to communicate that, sometimes there's no bucket in the head for that. It said, it just went right over there. So.
This one might, jump in, Allison. Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Because you stole one of the things I was going to say about weakness. But there's no question that your generation has incredible potential and skills and opportunities. But that can also be a weakness because you also live in a generation that for a number of decades has been very busy working on the basis of comparing oneself to other people. And that is a heavy burden to carry around. And I think an increasing number of very, very competent people can't figure out how to shed that burden and realize that it's enough to be competent. You don't have to be the best in everything. And I actually had a a colleague, well, no, she was younger than me, but she came to me at one point. She was just burning out because she was so good at everything. She was trying to do everything early in her career, and she was finally having to recognize that you can't be the best at everything. Maybe you've just about accomplished that in medical school, but once you get further running an ICU, no, and trying to do multiple other things. And so I think that there's something in your generation's culture that has set you up to feel incredibly anxious about whether you are living up to some mysterious, unspecified expectations.
Outstanding care always?
Like that. Where's the room for even a small failure? Okay. So I think that's a big weakness. And I think the other weakness for the people in this room here, and you're perhaps more prepared against it than the people who aren't in the room, because they didn't come, is I think you all need to think very hard about what things you've let the culture shape you within the church, because there's so many things within the church that nobody even notices, and they're not really Christ-based. They're culture-based. And as our world gets more complex, you're going to have an even bigger job of that than we had. And we didn't do a very good job of ferreting them out. We adopted a lot of them.
Also, one last thing is that I think it's great the fact that you're here, because it shows that you care and you're open. That is the first step to trying to improve things. If you just go along, not questioning, not thinking about it, not being open to discussion, then there is no point. You're actually people that will help lead to improvement.
So I'm going to bow out of this one, since this is mental health. What is the balance, in your opinion, between medication use and counseling in mental health, specifically from a Christian perspective?
I can speak to that a little bit. I've taken some Christian counseling courses, so that sometimes that makes it a bit of a struggle dealing with the mental health stuff that comes in, because I admitted a couple people this week who said they were suicidal, but the one was quite clearly acting out. She didn't get her own way, and so basically she was using that as a way of getting out of where she was living. And you can't call people on that, but it's in the emergency room setting, you're a little stuck. And basically, it's a struggle that way. When I've done longer locums and I've had people with psychiatric, with depression or what have you, I'm always encouraging people to get counseling as well. Like, they may be needing a medication, but they may be able to do fine just with the counseling, because there is research that shows for mild depression, cognitive behavioral therapy might be helpful. I encourage Christians to go to a biblical counselor or a Christian counselor, because I think they need to do that from a faith-based perspective. But yeah, a lot of people, what started first, was it that they had a chemical imbalance, or is there a sin pattern in their life? And maybe there's a mix of both, but we all have sin that we have to deal with. And yeah, so I think there's a place for medication, but I don't think that's the cure for these kind of things. So
I was married to a psychiatrist for many years, so this came up quite a bit. In the last 10 years of his life, he was very discouraged by the move towards designer drugs were going to cure everything, and the decrease in the amount of time and therefore money that people were beginning to be willing to spend on counseling. I've also seen lots of evidence through taking some Christian-based courses on counseling about the synergistic function of medications and counseling at the same time. if somebody isn't sleeping at all, you know what? They will not be counseled very effectively because they will not actually be able to take in, they won't be able to do the work of thinking through the things that they need to think through. So there is a very real place for appropriate medications to facilitate a counseling process. I do have a friend that I've got through us together, and she's become a very close friend over the years. At one point, she was a patient of my husband's, and then he looked very hard for somebody who could take over when he was in the final phase of his disease. And the best person he was able to find is not actually a person of faith, but has been a wonderful psychiatrist for this particular woman. I think she has had more impact on that psychiatrist than she will ever know, because God is part of her life, and it's part of her wrestling with her Asperger's and some of the complications it's caused. And so there was an overreaction in the Christian community of pastors trying to do too much counseling and then not being able to do the spiritual direction of their churches. So then there was a push to send them to Christian counselors. But then what often happened with Christian counselors was that they were becoming more secular and missing out the actual faith-based part. And at a time of crisis in my life, when there were a lot of things, a number of family issues that all came to crisis over a short period of time, my family doctor sent me to a psychiatrist because she didn't want to be responsible for a psychiatrist's wife, which was very logical. It was very interesting. The psychiatrist asked some very good questions to help me think clearly about what I needed to work through and think through. My Christian counseling friend and I prayed together and worked through them in a totally different way. But it was a great combo. So don't close your mind to different options. But medications are sometimes an important part for a patient being able to think clearly enough, sleep well enough to be able to do the work they need to do.
Great. In what relationships do you perceive that you've established covenant? What difference does covenant make in that relationship? Has this affected your understanding of your relationship with God? And how do you renew covenant on a regular basis?
Good questions. Nice.
Yes? You like the question? We want to lead us off?
Yeah, what did he say again? There's a lot of covenant in there.
There's a lot of covenant.
Okay. Contract is to consumer as covenant is to person. All people want to be treated as persons. Therefore, they will tend to look at you and the relationship in terms of covenant. Unless you're just going by a toll booth, they're going to want to relate to you that way. Dentistry is a contract, right? I don't make the bridge, you don't pay me, you don't pay me, I don't make the bridge. People understand that. And yet what brings them back year after year saying, I know I've left the hospital, but can you be my dentist? And do you see outsiders? How about my aunt as well? It's because they sense the care. Care is just the subjective perception that you've treated them under a covenant model rather than a contract model. It affects every relationship of your life. If the person thinks of himself as a person, is very open and inclined towards treated under a covenant model. Yep.
I get tomorrow morning to talk about this. So.
I can go back to my friend who has Asperger's. I found that it really did, when I ended up becoming a friend with her, it was sort of a God thing. And I couldn't, my husband was her psychiatrist, and nobody's visiting her. She's on the closed ward on constant in psychiatry. And why won't anybody from the church go and visit her? And so I figured, I guess I better go visit her. And because I was the other Dr. Phrase, the nurse didn't have to be the constant while I was visiting. But I couldn't talk about anything psychiatric because after all, that was his business, right? So we talked about all sorts of other things and found we had a lot of common interests. And so as that relationship developed, I did start to see her as a person, not my husband's patient. And she was incredibly good to us as a family. But covenant meant that when she rejected me and kicked me out and said, no, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I just want to be all by myself and my cats, and that's the only thing that's safe. It did hurt. But covenant was phoning up the next day and saying, hey, could I come over for a cup of tea? And finding out whether she buzzed the bell that I could go up to the apartment. And, it took a long time to convince her that I would not reject her. So it was safer for her to reject me first. But God just said, this is something I want you to do. And now she is somebody I can phone up anytime and say, I need a break, can you put the kettle on? So it's a reciprocal kind of thing. But covenant in that kind of situation, it can happen with patients in a practice that are, quote, difficult patients, is just that you let them come back. Or you reach out to them and say, do you need another appointment? So I think that's covenant.
We talked a bit this morning about with professional, like having a covenant with your colleagues and such. And with the locums that I do, I don't think about it. I say I'm going to work, I work. But there's a lot of locums apparently who bail on, and so they think I'm a great locum where I work, and I'm like, well, I'm just doing what I said I would do. So, but that's part of keeping covenant, is keeping your word. And so sometimes keeping like with Psalm 15, you keep your word even if it hurts you sometimes. If you said you would do something, you do it. And like it's also like when you're on call, like in Woodstock, we have someone's on call and you're supposed to make sure that the emerge is not getting more than 4 hours behind. And there are some people who take call, but they don't want to stay. And it's really frustrating working with people like that because they took the call, they get paid for being on call, but they're going to leave anyway. And so trying to be a conscientious colleague in that sense makes a big difference too.
I think it's like what's come out a lot here is the importance of recognizing the person's humanity and establishing that relationship where they feel as though they are of value. And if you do this in all of your interactions, you keep your word, as she mentioned, which is very important, which actually helps give credibility and trust. You'll find that sometimes you're actually surprised by the result. I had a patient that I had seen a few years ago because of heart surgery, and he now got a fracture, was transferred to a different rehab hospital. He complained until he was transferred to ours, and he got me as a doctor again. And that's just because if you actually take the time to listen to them and see where they are, see what they want, and share on that level, you'll find that it's enriching to you as it is to them, and you will find a lot of joy in your work. Most of the joy in your work is not what you're doing. It's who you work with. And who you work with is not just your colleagues, it's your patients. And you have to remember that these people are just as important to you as at least they should be as your colleagues. So they should be a priority in your day, and you should treat them as such as well. So they deserve the respect just as much as anyone else.
I want to say something quick about covenant renewal, as I heard a number of you are newlyweds. I'm 52. There's a time where people love each other, they get married, they have kids, they have busy careers. For a while it's all about the career, then it's all about the kids, then the kids grow up, they leave home, and then whether or not the two people are friends or lovers or strangers, what are we? Just today I got an email from a close friend of mine who's asking me for marital counseling. it's that time you realize covenant renewal is very, very important. Early on in Israel's history, people didn't need reminding what happened at Red Sea and Sinai. But then they entered the Promised Land, covenant renewal, a new generation that did not see the miracles. And then again, in Josiah's day, the covenant needs to be renewed because we'll tend to treat anybody who gives us covenant love, that reliable chesed, we'll tend to take that for granted. And then the relationship dies. You need to be reminded what you were without that person and what difference that person made to your life, and to be thankful, or else all your holy days will turn into just holidays, and every ritual will become meaningless. You need to have the ritual, but you need to refresh that ritual, that anniversary, that whatever it is, and infuse it with meaning, rather than just go do your charts and go out for a movie afterward.
I'll speak to most of this because I think I have a sense, being at the CMDS national level, some of this. Is there a decreasing number of doctors and dentists? Depends on how you define... Sorry, is there a decreasing number of Christian doctors? Sorry, I missed a very key word there. Sorry. Is there a decreasing number of Christian doctors and dentists? I think that would depend entirely on how you defined Christian. I think as the society becomes more and more secular, those that wore the label without the heart are dropping away. So if you do surveys and ask Christians, or ask doctors and dentists, like you ask all of Canadian society, about what label they choose to have attached to themselves, that number is in decline, as it is in the broader society. In terms of people committed to relationship with Christ, I'm not sure if that's changing. We don't have any data. So we all have perceptions. If so, how does that affect the profession? The way it affects the profession, I think, is that as the labels fall away, there used to be a fairly rich common understanding of how the universe is, which led to a fairly rich morality. As there is a fragmented view of how the world is, the common morality gets lower and lower and lower. So I'm going to throw this to the whole panel. So let me get to the end first and then throw this to the whole panel. Are there specialties in increasing need of Christian doctors? Yes, all of them. Can you give an example of when you shared the gospel with one of your non-believing colleagues or patients?
I was doing rounds one morning and we were talking about something else, and the one doctor we just started talking about Jesus. But she was struggling with her faith, or what faith she did have. Like, she didn't have any faith in Christ, but she had kind of grown up in a nominal Christian home and dealing with older parents and such. And I'm just like, I wasn't seeing that coming. It just happened. So that doesn't happen every day, that's for sure. So.
For me, it was my birthday and they brought in a cake. I don't know how we got talking, but I guess I was thinking about total depravity, and I had... This is true.
Birthday cakes always happen.
What kind of a birthday cake?
It was a lemon cream. No, I was looking up statistics on infidelity in general population. 20% for women, 10% for men, 30% for subscribers to Christianity Today out of 1,000 surveyed. Very high, higher than you would guess among Christian pastors.
Is it something to do with the course you were taking?
It's a sermon that I'm preparing.
Okay, there we go.
And of course, by this time, they're riveted. And they ask me, so have you ever cheated on your wife? And I gave them the answer that Jimmy Carter gave. You'll have to look it up.
Oh. You're going to do that to them?
I'm watching that camera over there. But then I began to explain, because there's a Jewish woman there, and I knew something about traditional Jewish beliefs. And then I reiterated that, talked about God, talked about his care for us, all the while knowing how treacherous we are. And I've noticed that it's very hard to share the entire gospel all in one sitting, but I think that day God gave me an opportunity to share one piece of it at depth in a way that really hit people.
There can be a signal given by the patient that they're open to this, or they ask you a question that brings up something that's in line with that, which can open up the discussion, but you won't necessarily see it every day. But it's just to remember to live it. Not necessarily, you're not trying to force anyone to believe what you believe, but if you live it, sometimes they will wonder, how come are you like this all the time? And that can bring about questions that can actually lead to interesting discussions.
This is going to have to be our final question for the time, and I realize that there's a whole lot of questions we didn't get to here, and my apologies. But as I say, we're all around, and I will send out an email with these people's emails. So have any of you, and the answer to this one is yes, I have, had patients from the LGBTQ plus population? If so, what are your thoughts, recommendations based on your experiences and knowledge? And I can give you that in 30 seconds. They're a person. They're a person in need of care. And I treat them like every other person in need of care, as a person created in the image of Christ, for whom I can help move them towards better health. And it may help that I'm a consultant and a specialist, and you're never in my office without a concrete problem. And I generally can fix the problem or tell you it's not my problem, which is one of the advantages of being a consultant. And so I am not, generally speaking, I'm not entering into a journey, a lifelong journey with a patient. I'm dealing with a patient who has a complaint, right? And the fact gender orientation is seldom relevant, and so is seldom discussed. But every single one of those patients is a person in need of respect, and certainly that patient population, there's a greater portion that have a history of wounding, and so often and wounding by people in power and positions of authority, and so having a professional treat them with respect, for some of them is a unique experience, a different experience, and may open conversations.
I'd say there's two things. One, it's true that we have to respect them, treat them well. Two, it's because if you look at the Old Testament, the New Testament, we consider the New Testament the New Covenant. How did Jesus treat other people? Only God is allowed to judge. He never mistreated anyone, no matter what their history was, no matter what they had done in the past. So why would we have a right to do so to anyone else? We should always treat others with love, caring, and respect, no matter what their life is. We are not above them. We are not below them. They are sharing the experience of life with us. And that's how we should treat them. There should be no difference whatsoever.
I've had a few patients on my list who are having transgender operations. And my biggest concern, what they need is a safe anesthetic from somebody who will look after them as a person who is coming for an operation. And my biggest concern is always, I write somewhere in good big letters which name they're going by at the moment. Because their chart is a mix of before and after names. And it's very easy to not get it clear, and I try to be very careful that I use the right name.
So that'll formally end this part. What tends to happen from here is that some of you who really wanted your question answered will find the person you want to have it answered from, and little pods kind of form in the room. Let's formally wrap up. Thank you very much for your attention.